don't know where you are, but I'm glad you're listening to us. You could be on the roads somewhere. A lot of people listening to, satellite radio in their cars. And if you've just discovered BYU Radio or if you've been coming back regularly, we're just glad that you can join with us. We've got a great topic for this half hour. My name's Marcus Smith. Glad to be with you here on the morning show on BYU Radio. Pleased to be on the BYU campus. It's a beautiful fall day here on campus, and I get a little bit of that. It's not seasonal affective disorder, but I get a little twinge of, it's not melancholy, but winter's on the way. See, I came from Southern California, and to be a Southern Californian and not to have experienced snow until you were like 15 years old, and then to come to BYU, I was a fish out of water, because by the time winter comes around, it can get really cold. I got over this whole habit, though, of getting a little bit on the sullen side of things, living here in Provo. I got over it when I found out that winter can be beautiful for winter sports, and there have been times in my life here in Utah, in the middle of winter, when I have been at 10,000 feet on one of those beautiful sunny days, when with a reflection off the snow and with a high pressure over you so it's not windy and there's no weather to speak of, you could be in a T-shirt just basking in the glory of winter. And I've had that experience too. But right now we're in the autumn. It's beautiful on campus today. That's all I wanted to say about that. We're on to our topic for this half hour. It has a little bit to do with parenting. I'm a father, got 4 children, and we're getting into a zone right now where my children, between the ages of, there's a 9-month-old. What is today? Is it today the 9th? Tomorrow. She will be 9 months old tomorrow. My oldest is 10, going on 11. Actually going on about 18 right now. But I'm working hard with my children to let them know that, yes, in spite of my corrections, in spite of my discipline, boy, I love you, and I want to do my best by you, and I want to help you. I want to be your ally. And sometimes I've had that experience. I think this happens to most every parent, where the child does not think you are the ally. The child thinks you are antagonistic. And this is what I've been getting a lot of lately. Well, you never say that to her. Or why does he always get? Or, well, that's just not fair. Those kinds of things. And they're trying to play me sometimes. They're just trying to play me, and I have to sometimes not get tempted to go down that road and play the game on their terms. But I'm navigating it, and I'm no expert, and so I'm navigating this terrain, trying to figure out, how do I disabuse my children of the notion that I prefer one over the other? Oh, whoops! Did I speak too soon? Do we have blind sides? Is it even possible that I, unbeknownst to myself, have favorites? I hadn't really gone down that road. I don't know that I could see that. But maybe my behavior, if somebody were a fly on the wall watching me from day to day, is it even conceivable that you or I or any parent might actually be treating our children differently and inequitably? These are important questions, and it's the topic for this half hour. We have with us in the studio right now Mike Pond of our staff. Mike, you have interviewed a fellow by the name of Alex Jensen. What took you down this road, and what were you trying to learn?
Well, I actually met Alex interviewing him about something else, video games, and he mentioned this topic, and I thought it was very interesting. In Western culture, we have this trend where we try to treat our children equally, and that's always not necessarily the case. When you have a 6-year-old, they may not be ready for a cell phone as compared to a 16 or 17-year-old. And he kind of went down the path of studying what kind of effect that has on emotional health if children perceive that their treatment is perceived as fair, if it's different.
Yeah, this is a great topic. I'm glad you were able to do the interview. Let's just say that Alex Jensen is currently doing his work at Penn State and is pursuing some very interesting studies about this whole way we treat our children. Let's learn from your conversation and roll that audio.
Welcome, Alex. How are you?
Thank you. I'm good. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit about the study?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, we were interested in studying differential treatment, or at least that's the research term, or parental favoritism, with these young adult siblings. Nobody had done that before, so that was kind of novel. But then, like you mentioned, we tackled this idea of if you're the favorite child or the less favorite child in the family, is that different than the amount of favoritism or discrepant treatment that the parents are showing? The reason we wanted to look at that is past research and theory is a little bit conflicting. There's some research that suggests that favored children are going to fare better. So if you look at some sort of outcome like depressive symptoms, a child who is more favored by their parents is going to be less depressed. And a child who, or in this case, an adult child who is less favored by their parents will be more depressed. But then some other research suggests that when there's just a larger amount of discrepant treatment from the parents, that both siblings will be more depressed. So there's kind of that conflict in the research, and we wanted to tackle those two approaches, or those two ideas about parental favoritism.
This is something I've always been interested in because in my family, I have one younger brother, and it seemed like we're about 3 years apart, and so he's kind of the baby of the family, and whenever we'd play a board game like Monopoly or something, I mean, we'd always let him win, and it seemed like that treatment carried on into adulthood now, and I've always been, that's kind of a Western thing. I mean, Western culture generally encourages parents to treat their children equally, but that doesn't usually happen, as we see. Is it okay to treat your kids differently?
That's a really hard question to answer. Well, maybe not to answer, but to completely grasp.
Right.
The easy answer is yes, it's okay to treat your kids differently, and maybe you should. So a good example, straying away from the adulthood topic here, is I was at a conference recently and talking about this with some researchers, and one of them said, yeah, I have this friend, and she has 2 kids, and they're pretty close in age, but the one child has some pretty severe physical issues and can't go outside to play. It's not healthy for them. And the parents are so concerned about treating their kids the same and treating them equally that they don't let the non-disabled child go out to play. They keep them inside, to the point that it's now starting to cause some health issues for the non-disabled child. So that's an extreme example, but teaching or treating those kids exactly the same is not healthy, really,
right,
for either of them. And you take like you and your brother, even if there's not those extreme differences, there are going to be differences in personality, there's going to be differences in temperament that really necessitate the parents do need to treat their children differently. The question then becomes, what's appropriate in treating your kids different, and when does it become unhealthy? Unfortunately, that we don't have the answers to. Maybe if you interview me in another 15 years, I might know those answers, but at the moment, we don't know.
Right, yeah, and I was going to ask you that. I mean, if me and my brother, we don't have, it's not an extreme situation, but it looks like this is a case-by-case thing that you need to really take a look at your family and see, should I try to treat my kids the same, or should I treat them differently? And it looks like your study shows, are parents aware that they're treating their kids differently? Is this something that we're conscious of, or does it just automatically happen?
Yeah, and that's a really good question that empirically we don't really have the answer to, a solid answer.
Mm-hmm.
I would think in a lot of cases, parents know they're treating their kids differently, whether they're willing to admit it or not. But I would want to think, too, that parents, at least some parents, wouldn't know the extent to which they're treating their kids differently. And maybe they don't know whether that's appropriate or not. I think that's probably a question a lot of parents have is, okay, if I am treating my kids different, is it that appropriate differences or is it not?
Yeah, that's a very personal question.
It is.
within the family. And were you able to see a trend as far as who parents tend to favor?
Yeah, in this study, to some degree we did. And it was a little unexpected, maybe is the right word to use. So there's some research that would suggest that fathers are going to favor sons and mothers are going to favor daughters. In this study, we didn't quite get at that, but we saw that mothers were tending to favor their children who actually needed help. And maybe that's a different thing than we think of favoritism. You think of favoritism as, having a negative impact on the child, but with these young adults, those who were more depressed were more likely to get support from their mothers. With fathers, it was the other way around, that those who were less depressed were getting the more support, or they were favored by their fathers. So maybe fathers tend to favor their kids who don't need as much care and attention, and maybe mothers are more concerned about helping their children that really need that help.
And that brings to mind, in the journal, there's this verbiage that differential treatment and favoritism. And we were talking about favoritism right now, but is there a difference between those? Are they the same thing, differential treatment versus favoritism?
That's a good question. That will vary. Research-wise, that will depend on the researcher that you talk to. Some will tell you they're the same thing, and some will tell you they're very different things. I would say they're kind of the same thing, but if you want to make a distinction, favoritism may be more a child's interpretation, the way they feel about it.
More attention, maybe?
More possibly attention, or it could be on other domains like conflict or privileges. But if the child feels like they are not getting as good of treatment, maybe you could label that favoritism. Whereas if you talk about bedtimes, one child is 15 and the other child is 5, and you send the 5-year-old to bed before you send the 15-year-old to bed, maybe that's not favoritism, but it's certainly differential treatment because you're treating them differently. Maybe
that's just fairness. Is there a distinction between favoritism and fairness?
Yeah, I think that comes at the child level too. So there's some interesting research by two researchers named Amanda Cole and Lori Kramer that were kind of looking at differential treatments. So say those two, the 5-year-old and the 15-year-old, and they get sent to bed at a different time. But then they also asked the siblings, is that treatment fair? So fairness and differential treatment actually are separate things, because maybe they could be treated the same, but one child doesn't see that as fair, or they could be treated differently and they see it as fair. So what they found was that if parents are treating their kids differently, but the siblings see that as fair, then it doesn't matter. Then treating them differently actually may be appropriate. Is maybe another way to think of that. But if they are treating them differently and the children don't see that as fair, that's when they were running into a lot of issues. When the less favored children were having poorer behavior, and favored children actually were having better behavior. And I think why researchers label it as differential treatment, or at least tend to more than favoritism, is because favoritism is very subjective. How do you really measure if somebody is the favorite? Whereas differences in treatment is much easier to quantify. It's easier to at least talk about from a research perspective. But on the parents' level, I think that's important too. Thinking about, favoritism isn't just about, do I love one child more than the other? Or maybe that is what favoritism is, but differential treatment really isn't just about love. It's about differences in treatment, whether that be bedtimes, whether that be privileges, whether that be you love one child more than the other. That could be spending more time with one child than the other. It could be investing more money in one child than the other. And again, that isn't inherently bad. The parent just needs to think about whether it really is appropriate or not.
And do you think it affects whether the other siblings view that treatment. If they don't see that treatment, is that going to cause problems? Like perception versus reality. You were talking earlier about perceived fairness.
Right.
What matters? What really matters?
That's a really good question. So if the siblings don't know they're being treated differently, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And the data from this study that I published in the journal Marriage and Family earlier this year, it does kind of give some hints to that answer. So we looked at depressive symptoms, but then we also looked at their relationship with each other. And you have to remember these are adult siblings, and most of them are not living together. And so if they're being treated differently from each other, it's possible they know, but it's also possible that they don't know. And we did see that siblings who were less favored reported poorer relationships with their sibling than the sibling who was favored. So that would kind of suggest that, even though they may not know that they're being treated differently from each other, it's still impacting their relationship.
Why does this really matter? Do the children that are favored, do they receive any kind of benefit from that relationship?
In some cases they do, yeah. So in terms of their relationship with their sibling, at least from this study, it didn't matter. The favored children had no effect. The less favored children were the ones who were suffering. But in terms of depression, at least from fathers, yes. Favored children by their fathers were reporting lower depressive symptoms, so they were less depressed. But there's an interesting catch with that, too, is you have to consider what the gender of the sibling is. And this is a pretty common finding in the literature, the research, is that when you're talking about a brother and a sister, the effects may not be there. Favoritism or differential treatment may not matter as much. But if you're looking, say, at two brothers, like yourself and your younger brother, that's when the effects tend to emerge more or be stronger. So in this study, it's when children were favored, but their sibling was the same gender, that's when they reported less depressive symptoms. But if you were favored and you had an opposite gender sibling, so for yourself, if you had a sister, then the favoritism actually didn't matter.
Did it matter which parent favored the sibling more? Did that have any effect?
Yeah, absolutely. So in this case, that finding was only if it was from fathers. For mothers, the effect wasn't there.
And do you have any hypothesis, any idea why that might be?
Yeah. So if you think about family life, and this, extends beyond LDS culture, but is particularly true in LDS culture, the mothers are more involved on the day-to-day basis. Even if they're not staying at home, if they're working, mothers still do more of the child care than do fathers. And in this case, with adulthood, mothers still tend to be more involved with their children than our fathers. So it could be that uniqueness of the father relationship. Mothers are just kind of ubiquitous. They're always there. But with fathers, the treatment or the support or attention may be more of a scarce commodity. And so that's maybe why the favoritism or the differential treatment from fathers really matters more.
So how did you gather this information? How did you find this stuff out?
Yeah, this is a very unique study, the way in which we approached this. So initially we contacted parents, specifically parents who are more middle-aged, so around 50-ish, give or take 10 years. So we talked to them about their family relationships with their spouse, if they had one, with their parents, and then also their relationships with their children. Then we asked these parents to nominate up to 3 of their children. Many of them only had 2 or 3 children, so that made it easier. But to nominate a few of their children that we could go contact. We then went and contacted their children and invited them to participate in the study as well. So we interviewed up to 3 siblings per family about their relationships with their parents again, their relationships with their siblings, and then some more personal things like depressive symptoms, anxiety, some other things like that. So then to actually conduct this study, statistically it's very difficult to look at more than 2 siblings per family. And so then we chose 2 of the siblings per family to look at the differential treatment between those 2 siblings.
And was this a phone interview, or did you have them come in?
Yeah, they were all conducted over the phone. The parents, most of them lived in Pennsylvania, and actually a lot of the young adult siblings did as well, but they really came from all over the country, from Florida to Tennessee to even over to the West Coast.
So we get a good idea of, a modern American family differential treatment or favoritism.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's good.
And then an interesting thing about this study, too, is it's fairly diverse. So about 75% of the sample was European American or Caucasian, and about a quarter of the sample was actually African American. So it's pretty diverse as well. Yeah, so thinking about, what does this mean for parents? As a parent myself, I often think about my research. What does this mean for about how I'm treating my kids? And this is separate from this actual article, but some other work that I'm doing at the moment is looking at, so if I treat my kids differently, will they perceive that they're being treated differently? And does the fact that I'm treating them differently, does that matter independent of whether they perceive they're being treated differently? And the answer is that they kind of both matter. So if I do treat my kids differently, they're more likely to perceive that unfairness or that favoritism. But both the favoritism or their perception of it and the fact that I'm actually treating them differently has implications for things like substance use, for delinquency. So children who are less favored or are treated poor by their parents relative to their sibling are more likely to use alcohol. They're more likely to use cigarettes or other drugs like marijuana. They're more likely to skip school or cheat on tests. So there's some important implications there. But even if I don't treat my kids differently, they may still feel like they're being treated differently. And in that case, that still has implications for substance use and for delinquency. And so, it's kind of this tricky spot for parents. If you are treating your kids fairly, or treating them differently but in appropriate ways, that may solve some of the problem. But maybe your kid still feels like it's not fair, even though it really is. So somehow parents got to learn to tackle that issue, not of just treating them equally or fairly, but helping the kids to feel like it's equal and fair too. How to do that, I have no idea. As a researcher or as a parent, maybe that's the $1 million question. But it's something maybe parents should try to do at the very least.
Do you have plans in the future to build off of this study to maybe examine more in depth what you just discussed? How can parents make it seem like it's fair? Hopefully it is fair. But what can we expect from you in the future?
That is on the distant horizon. That one I need to figure out how to collect data to really get at it appropriately.
That's a hard topic to tackle.
Really, it is.
Thank you so much for your time, and we wish you luck in the future.
It's a conversation with Alex Jensen. Dr. Alex Jensen was an undergrad at Brigham Young University studying family life, went on for a master's and PhD in human development and family studies from Purdue. He's currently a research associate at Penn State, and we expect he'll be teaching at BYU actually next year. Great topic. It turns out that Alex Jensen is the youngest of 6 children. And maybe, just maybe, that personal history figures into his interest in this kind of a study, don't you think, Mike?
Oh, yeah. Talking to him, he said, being the youngest of 6 and the closest sibling to his age was 4 years older and left the house when he was 11. And ever since, he's kind of been hooked on the topic and interested in family dynamics.
Well, it's a great conversation, great topic, certainly worth our consideration and thinking about, and we wish Dr. Alex Jensen well in the future, and I'm sure we'll come back to him. We're going to round out this half hour of the morning show, turning now to a morning drive on BYU Radio. Before we do, thanks to you, Mike, for being with us.
No problem.